My Lord Bishop, Professor Nyland, several distinguished members of the clergy, bishops, what a joy it is to be here. I do think this gathering exhibits great faith in the Catholic doctrine of indulgences. You'll understand by this doctrine that for suffering endured on earth, you receive time off in purgatory. And so you're going to have now half an hour of exquisite suffering. And for bishops and clergymen and businessmen to submit themselves to being lectured at by a journalist, for God's sake, is equivalent to St. Ignatius wearing a hair shirt and flogging himself and so forth, you know. I want to acknowledge two dear friends, two old friends, James Power and Michael Casey. They are particularly heroic, really, to put up with being lectured at by me again, and they're suckers for punishment, and their willingness to endure this hardship for the sake of their faith is kind of heroic. It may not be quite yet on a par with Edmund Campion, but nonetheless it's heading in that direction. Now, I want to talk to you, I don't know if there was a title in the program, but it's such a privilege to talk to you, and of course I'm completely intimidated by the presence of bishops. You know, what would a loutish, renegade Irish Catholic journalist have to say in front of bishops and distinguished Catholics in Brisbane? And the danger of making a mistake is enormous, but that's a danger which we journalists are always happy to embrace. Indeed, I've often said not knowing anything about a subject should never be a bar to having a strong opinion about it. And you've got to admit we journalists live that injunction out to the full. I thought, whatever the formal title of the address was, that I'd talk to you about the present moment that we're in, and I'd address that by talking about this book that I've written called God is Good for You. Now, Jim, in his very kind introduction, said that I'm the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, which is true. I've been a professional full-time journalist now for 40 years, and mostly I've specialised in foreign affairs, although I take a very wide view of what foreign affairs is, that is to say anything which interests the foreign editor. The paper has been very indulgent about all that. But it's only in the last few years that I've started to write about religious issues, and going public, as it were, as a Catholic was a bit like coming out of the closet. And it was quite a big decision in itself to do that. I'm old enough that I remember the old secular agreement in Australian public life that in order to stop Catholics and Protestants from arguing all the time, we basically didn't talk about religion in public. That was certainly the view in journalism when I entered the business 40 years ago. But in my 40 years in the trade, I've seen the broader culture go from being notionally supportive of Christianity to neutral about it, and now to being outright hostile to it. And in the end, I thought, given that Christianity, and especially Holy Mother Church, are so often under attack, if circumstances just contrive to give you a public microphone, it really is a species of cowardice not to own up to what you really believe in. And then, of course, once you make the decision to get into this field, you find two great things. First of all, journalists are always on the lookout for great material, and there is no better material than Christianity and Christians in our society and throughout history. It's the most important subject, so it's interesting to write about. And secondly, it's a subject which is of great interest to readers and consumers generally. The public culture has become so hostile to Christianity, it's both whited Christianity out of the public culture, and it has become very hostile to Christianity. I think we have become a minority now, but we still represent, 40 or 50% of the population, but we don't get 40 or 50% of the representation in public culture. 20 and 30 years ago, I used to argue that there were not enough Asians on our TV screens. This was very unrealistic. Well, today there are not enough Christians, and any Christians you do see in a drama or a sitcom or anything are either kooks or fanatics or child abusers or criminals or murderers or something else. I shouldn't confess this to you, but I'm watching a terrible series on Netflix at the moment called Riverdale. It's one of those American series which is unspeakably dreadful and also utterly addictive. You know, it's completely compelling. Once you get into it, you can't stop. And there's a resident house of evil run by an order of Catholic nuns. And you think, the poor old nuns, against whom no accusation has ever been made of any substance at all, the most heroic and dedicated people in Christendom, who, if you're dying, will mop your brow and lift the drink to your lips and care for you no matter what your background and so on, are traduced in this insane fashion as though they are torturers and imprisoners of recalcitrant teenagers. In any event, I shouldn't get sidetracked on that, but I think it's overwhelmingly the case that popular culture has become hostile now to Christianity. Now, one of the hesitations in coming out, so to speak, is that, you know, let me tell you, if you've been 40 years a journalist, you know, can't speak for others, but you've probably led a pretty rackety life. You know, my friend Tony Abbott was giving a talk recently about his Christian beliefs, and he said, well, I'm pretty sure I've broken 9 of the 10 commandments. He said, I don't think I've murdered anybody, and I'd join with him in that. I think I'm pretty clear on the murder front, on the other 9. And we journalists lead a very rackety life. I mean, in the course of writing this book, I discovered a number of politicians who, after a life in politics, went into holy orders, like Father Michael Tate in Tasmania, or Lynn Arnold, the former Premier of South Australia, who's now an Anglican clergyman. You never see a journalist go into holy orders after a life in journalism. And so this is a long-winded way of saying, you know, you're not morally qualified to enter this debate. But on the other hand, if you leave the discussion of Christianity to those people who are morally qualified, it's going to be a fairly small group discussion. So it's better just to wade in and publish and be damned, so to speak. Now, the particular motivation for writing this book, called God is Good for You, so it attempts to be a non-denominational book. I don't hide that I'm a Catholic. I'm a very proud Catholic, very grateful for the inheritance of being a Catholic, and as far as I can, loyal to the faith and so forth. But the book is non-denominational. It looks for what C.S. Lewis called the mere Christianity, the consensus of mere Christianity. So I travelled a lot across denominations in Australia, and one piece of good news is that the denominations now are all friends with each other. The old hostilities are gone. Where we agree on 99% and disagree on 1%. We used to have the old Irish disease of concentrating furiously on the 1%. We now concentrate a bit more on the 99%. But nonetheless, the motivation for writing this book sprang partly from the last book I wrote, which I think was about 4 years ago. I went to a lot of writers' festivals to speak about this book, and overall I saw hundreds of books being promoted, and not one of them was written from a pro-Christian point of view, not a single one. And I thought, that's very strange. Christianity is absolutely central to our civic and broader culture, and yet there's not a single book about it. It also happens to be true, and yet there's not a single book about it. So I thought here I could contribute my thimbleful to the great ocean of human discourse, and at least for a little while there'd be one book in the airport bookshops which was actually pro-Christian. I mean, typically if you go into an airport bookshop now, there won't be a section called religion, but there might be a section called spirituality. The first shelf will be about the Dalai Lama and Buddhism. Nothing against the Dalai Lama, he's a very nice bloke and I esteem the religion of Buddhism. Then the second shelf will be thin thighs in 30 days, yoga and how to feel better about yourself, lean in, make money, feel good, you know, be your truest, richest self and so on. And then the third shelf will be books about how wicked Christianity is. You know, there'll be no books about Christianity, but there'll be Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great and so on. And then you're waiting to see where the balance is, where the other side is, and it's not there. So I thought I'd have a crack, so to speak. Now, I decided, Paul Johnson once remarked that the only way for him to learn anything about a subject and to retain any knowledge was to write a book about it. Now, he wrote 40 or 50 books. I haven't inflicted that many on an innocent public, but this is my 7th book, and I know how he feels. You only really come to grips with a subject when you actually write a book about it. And I wanted to answer several key questions for myself. One was, are we in fact losing God as a culture? And I have to tell you, the bad news is, yes, we are. So unlike the rest of the world, the West is heading radically and rapidly into unbelief. And it's much better to be quite upfront and direct and acknowledge this. We've got to have good situational awareness. I spend a lot of my time with military folks. I love military metaphors. A lot of my Christian friends hate it about my writing, but you can't please everyone, especially with your metaphors. We need to recognise where the incoming fire is, recognise our situation, have a high level of situational awareness. Western Europe, a large number of countries in Western Europe, certainly Britain, have become predominantly atheist nations. The larger number of people do not believe in God. We're sort of on the cusp. The last census showed that about 52% of people were Christians, but given how overwhelmingly the older age cohorts are Christian and how poor is our representation in the younger age cohorts, even since then, I think we've probably slipped down into minority status. The United States has a higher level of belief, but is on exactly the same trend. Every younger age cohort is less religious than the age cohort which is directly above it. Now, this is in great contradistinction to the rest of the world. Christianity and religion generally are on fire in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. It's a mixed picture for our own beloved church. I mean, the greatest expansion in China really is in the Bible-based Protestant home church movements. Pentecostalism is on fire in Latin America. Catholicism is on fire in Africa. And the vast majority of human beings on the planet today believe in God. Christianity is growing rapidly. The vast majority of people who have ever lived in the history of humanity believe in God. But in our Western culture, we are getting to a position of a majority belief in no God. That is a revolutionary change for our culture. What do we lose if we lose God as a culture? I argue that we lose a basis for morality. I certainly don't mean sexual morality by that. I just mean morality in the broadest sense. Even Richard Dawkins acknowledges this. He says in his book, The God Delusion, that without a belief in God, there is no ultimate distinction between right and wrong. And if our message to every human being is just follow your dream, well, what if your dream involves killing 100 people or killing 6 million people or having sex with 6-year-olds? Why is your dream any less valid than anyone else's dream if there is no ultimate arbiter? What is a sense of right and wrong all about if there is no God? If we feel moral outrage, Milovangelos said the beginning of everything is moral outrage. But where is the sense in moral outrage if there is no God to provide a standard? What are we outraged against? It's just our subjective feelings as opposed to someone else's subjective feelings. The second thing we lose is purpose. Viktor Frankl's beautiful writings about surviving the death camps in the Holocaust, especially man's search for meaning, he comes to the conclusion that what everybody needs in their life is purpose and meaning, and that you can survive anything with purpose and meaning. Indeed, there's a beautiful passage where his wife was in a different Nazi concentration camp from him, and he got great consolation from contemplating the image of his wife. And he understood for the first time in his life what the scriptures meant when they talked about the angels in divine contemplation, singing the praises of God, in divine singing and praise, and how this could constitute a life. Now, in the end, every human life, however it's conceived, however it's lived, embodies tragedy and ends in tragedy, and often a great deal of suffering as well. Every human being stands on the brink of oblivion at every moment of their lives, and they're all in need of God's mercy. We can sort of distract ourselves from that, and that's what the West is busy doing, treating life as an ocean cruise where you provide the maximum number of distractions you can. without God, there is in the end no meaning and no purpose. And finally, of course, if we lose God, we lose truth. This is the madness afflicting the Western Academy at the moment, because in the end, you can't intellectually believe in truth if you don't believe in the absolute. And here's where the new atheists drive themselves mad, and they drive anyone else mad who's silly enough to read them seriously, because in the end, it's always a circle back to nowhere. Every proposition rests on an earlier proposition which has no basis in anything absolute, and it's all just a construct. So we lose morality, purpose and truth, in my view. Another question I wanted to answer, is belief in God reasonable? Because I think Christians are being bluffed out of their beliefs at the moment. They're being told that no serious person continues to believe in God, continues to believe in Christianity. It's kind of a bit embarrassing for public figures to admit that they do believe in God. This is one reason I had 2 chapters in the book interviewing politicians who are believing Christians. And they all were wonderful interlocutors and impressed me with their faith, and I make no judgment about their politics. Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten, Tony Abbott, Christina Keneally, Penny Wong, Andrew Hastie, lots of figures, Mike Baird on the Labor Party and in the Liberal Party. And they were all very shy. I don't think they were cowards, I think they were modest, but our culture is contrived that people in public life are very shy to talk about their belief. So I think just getting that testimony out is important. But I do try to establish in the book that belief in God is entirely rational. In fact, it's atheism which requires of you much more magical thinking. So for instance, you go through Richard Dawkins and he has to come to grips with the incredible unlikely quality of our universe. You know, if the Big Bang had been a bit stronger, all the planets would have dissipated. If it had been a bit weaker, the planets would have gone back into a black hole. Carbon is necessary for life, but it's quite eccentric the way carbon developed. Everything had to be just right. It had to be a Goldilocks universe. Statistically, it's unbelievably improbable that life developed. And so to cope with this, Dawkins says, well, I'll accept Stephen Hawking's theory that there are simply an infinite number of universes and we lucked into the one that happens to be right for life. So he can reject what humanity has always believed in God and just invent an infinite number of universes without any evidence or any indication or anything else. That is much more a leap of faith. That's much more magical thinking than anything that is involved in traditional religious belief. Roger Scruton, in his beautiful book, The Soul of the World, argues that although you can get to God through reason, the most important evidence for God is the long human experience of God. And of course, the new atheists don't like to admit this because they say it's subjective. But in a court, for example, you examine the evidence, you'd examine people's testimony. And we have a testimony now over countless millennia of people experiencing God in their lives. Then there was a very simple question: what do Christians actually believe? Part of the crisis of faith that we have today is indeed a crisis of knowledge. And at one point in the book, I make a respectful, modest challenge to Christian schools. And you know, we Australian journalists are noted for our respectful, modest demeanour and the respectful, modest way that we speak about all subjects. That why aren't they providing the basic knowledge of Christian belief? I was at a lunch recently with the leader of a Christian school, not a Catholic school, but I certainly won't, defame the person or the institution by saying who it was. And it was a great and famous Christian school, and the principal said to me, well, we take religion very seriously. We've got a chaplain at our school. And I said, so what religious instruction do you do? And he said, every cycle the students do a religious study period. And I said, well, how long does a cycle take? And he said, well, it varies a bit, but it's about 2 weeks. So once every 2 weeks, you're teaching your students the content of belief in an institution which is meant to be dedicated to the propagation of Christianity? I said, how can this be? It's insane. It should be every day, of course. Why doesn't every school, for one semester in Year 9, go through the Apostles' Creed and just give students a knowledge of what belief is, because there is an enormous amount of sociological evidence that even people who are nominally Christian, if they are under about 50, they have almost no knowledge of what Christian belief actually is. So they might have a sentimental attachment to Christianity, they might have very profound faith, but they have no real knowledge of what Christian belief is. And the principal involved in this discussion with me just said, well, you know, it's a very crowded curriculum and so on. But isn't that perverse? A Christian school which finds the curriculum too crowded for Christianity. That strikes me as a bit weird. That suggests to me that not all of our problems are imposed on us by the hostile culture. Some of them are, if you like, homegrown. So the approach I take in my book is very straightforward. I just basically go through the creed and a few essential beliefs. And after the book was published, I had a wonderful, wonderful experience. Many clergymen of many different denominations wrote to me, and the letters, it was as if they all had the same template. They all were written in this way. Dear Greg, good on you for writing your book. Well done. It's a good effort, you know, a bit amateurish, but it's a good effort. It's a good effort. Well done. We're very happy to see you having this go. And I'd like to encourage you, and if you're around, come and have a cup of coffee. And by the way, on page 178, you made the following theological mistakes. Bang, 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 bang. And it's a joy to receive such letters, because I did indeed make quite a few mistakes, but also I put some things in which I thought were universal but turned out amongst Christians, but turned out to be specifically Catholic things, even though I tried not to do that. And but there were some things that I didn't realise were just for Catholics. I mean, I do understand purgatory is just for Catholics, although if you've lived a life as a journalist, purgatory is a very consoling idea, you know. And what was the old line? You know, the object of the Catholic Church is to get the largest number of people into purgatory that it can. And, you know, I love that doctrine of purgatory. Nobody's ever going to take that doctrine away from me, let me tell you. But the response to it amongst Christians was terrific. But it is clear to me that the lack of knowledge of what Christians believe is a very big part of the crisis of faith. Now, you wouldn't get faith just from knowledge, but without knowledge, even when you encounter inevitably your crisis of disbelief, you have no faith, you have no knowledge of what the faith is to return to. Now, that's not for me to preempt or limit the ways that God finds his way into people's hearts and the way that people find their way to God. That can even overcome the Australian education system. But nonetheless, why do we make it so hard? And then, of course, there are a couple of chapters which I wrote just for fun. So like many Catholics, of course, I had not spent any time reading scriptures, and certainly not the Old Testament. So I thought I'd better have a look at the Old Testament. What fantastic fun the Old Testament is. Now, I don't want to be a heretic here, but in many ways the Old Testament is kind of more fun than the New Testament, really. I mean, so I apologise, and there's no nihil obstat on that statement. It's just a matter of taste. I'm not expressing theology here, just taste. But I focused on 3 books of the Old Testament in particular. I wrote quite a lot about the Old Testament because there is no more radical pro-human rights statement in the ancient world than the statement in the book of Genesis that humanity is created in the image of God. These things we know, but most of us are not really that familiar with the individual books of the Bible, of the Old Testament. What fun they are. The book of Ruth is the greatest short story in the history of human literature. It's magnificent. The book of Jonah, what fantastic fun the book of Jonah is. It is a rollicking Mel Brooks comedy of the greatest accomplishment. There's Jonah told by God to preach to the evil Ninevites. He hates the Ninevites. Like a good journalist, he takes the expenses and runs off to take a cruise instead, but God won't let him do that. He flings him into the belly of a big fish for 3 days, very unpleasant for Jonah. Typical. God responding really much as an editor-in-chief would respond. And I must say the Old Testament had great sub-editors because it understood the 2 principal rules of journalism: humanise the story and get the names right. Anyway, poor old Jonah goes off to preach to these evil people in Nineveh, and he doesn't want to convert them. He wants them to stay licentious and meet the punishment that they deserve. So he is very much like Mel Brooks's characters in The Producers, who produce a musical designed to fail, you know. They produce a musical about Nazi Germany, certain that it will fail, and of course it's a big success. Jonah is in just the same circumstance. There he is going around Nineveh, and the Ninevites listen and repent, and he is so annoyed about it, and he goes off into a terrific sulk for the rest of the book, and he's unconsolable. It doesn't matter that he's done a good job. He sort of metaphorically shakes his fist at God and says, look what you made me do. Now these Ninevites are going to avoid the punishment which they absolutely 100% deserve. But of course, the book of Jonah, like all the parts of the Old Testament, has a magnificent message to it, which is that the God even of the Old Testament is a universal God. He's a God of the Ninevites as well as the God of the Israelites, and that repentance is all that is necessary for them to find God's mercy. And then, of course, the book of Job, which is the most magnificent contemplation and meditation on innocent human suffering in the history of human literature. It is an inexhaustible book. It is magnificent beyond description. I could spend the rest of my life studying the book of Job. There are wonderful moments in it where Job feels that God has abandoned him, and he seeks a dialogue with God. And then he gets his dialogue with God, and God says, okay, well, what have you got to say for yourself? And Jonah says, well, what can I say to you? I'm small. I'm small. That's the condition of humanity before God. Through all the ages, I'm small. Job reminded me of my 2-year-old granddaughter. I'll say to her sometimes, why don't you make the dinner, Manisha, or do the washing up? And she'll say, but I'm little. I'm little. And here is a recognition of the essential truth of the human condition. In any way, I should stop going on about the Old Testament, but it is so much fun. And here again, what a weird act of vandalism we're doing to our kids, subjecting them to the Safe Schools program and making sure they know about occupational health and safety and, you know, every other fad you can imagine. They've got to sing hymns about global warming and everything. But by golly, they're not going to get any of the Old Testament. We're going to make sure they grow up and they never read Ruth or Job or Jonah or Genesis or Ecclesiastes. And really, in anything but the worst translation, these books are just flames that you cannot put out. They're extraordinary. They just leap out at you over the centuries. Then there's a chapter on the problems of Christianity, innocent suffering, the existence of evil. Why would a good God create a world in which there is evil? And then, of course, the sins of Christians. So I try to acknowledge that being a Christian doesn't absolve you of the human condition. You're still tempted to be evil, and Christians have been evil from time to time throughout history. There's no doubt about that, so it's best to confront it honestly and so forth, and take some solace in the insight of Alexander Solzhenitsyn that the line between good and evil is not between those people over there who are good and those people over there who are evil. The line between good and evil runs down the middle of every human heart, and it's a struggle every day between good and evil within every human heart. Then the second part of the book is an exploration of the experience of Christians in Australia. 2 chapters, as I say, are on politicians. I was astounded by the depth and texture and quality of the inner life of these politicians. Every one of them was reluctant to do the interview. Not one person agreed to it straight up. They saw no political upside to it. They were shy, they were modest. I felt like a dentist, you know, inflicting terrible bodily pain on them in exchange for some good. Malcolm Turnbull, who was then Prime Minister, good man, genuine, serious religious belief, as does everyone in the book, did everything he could to escape from this interview, short of actually turning me down. He'd say, well, what is your absolute deadline, Greg? And I'd say, well, next Tuesday. Then he'd ring me back next Wednesday and say, oh, mate, I'm so sorry, I missed the deadline. Don't worry, I said, I can extend it for you. And at the very last possible minute, when it was still physically possible to get the interview into the book, he did the interview. And like all the other politicians, there's no political agenda here. Kim Beazley, wonderful, wonderful man to interview. I was astonished at well, not astonished, but I was rewarded by the depth and texture of his understanding. Turnbull actually has very deep theological knowledge. It's so weird. We were doing an episode of Q&A once, and we were texting each other, flippantly and foolishly and frivolously was the word I was looking for beforehand. And he said, God, the situation is very depressing. Why don't we talk about something other than politics? I said, yeah, what would you suggest? He said, how about medieval theology? I said, okay, that's good. What topic will we address? And he said, how about the Apollinarian heresy? Now, if memory serves, I think the Apollinarian heresy held that Jesus didn't have a human mind or something. I'm just a bit vague on it right at the moment, but it didn't leap out at me. And I said, no, the Apollinarian heresy is a bit too hard. Let's deal with Duns Scotus, the subtle doctor and the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. So yes, Malcolm said, that's great. Let's do that. And he said, the winner, whoever mentions it first gets a bottle of champagne from the other. So we're in the middle of Q&A and we're talking about government economic policy. And I said, the problem with the Abbott government is that it discusses economic policy with all the approachability of Duns Scotus defining the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Malcolm burst into laughter, and I've got to pay a tribute to his honesty. The next day he sent me a bottle of champagne, and everyone else on the panel in the characteristic Q&A way said, well, yes, of course, Duns Scotus. That's, I've always thought that about Duns Scotus myself. But really, how big is Malcolm's brain that there's a whole compartment dealing with the Apollinarian heresy and Duns Scotus and so forth? And all the politicians surprised me in that way. I'm running out of time, so I must conclude. The other politicians were equally impressive and magnificent. Andrew Hastie told me a very moving story of when he had ordered a fire strike in Afghanistan and the American planes hit the wrong people and killed 2 innocent little boys. And he had to go and seek forgiveness from their uncle. And he said to me how inconsolable and how desperate this would be if there were no God to redeem this world and to redeem those little boys. And it was certainly the most difficult experience of his life, and one that he was willing to share and put in the context of belief. Penny Wong, figure on the left wing of the Labor Party, nonetheless, deep Christian faith, and there are no marks in asserting herself to be a Christian in the left wing of the Labor Party, so she was courageous to do it as well. And then I looked for signs of new life. I have to say, while I remain a steadfast and honest Catholic, I was tremendously impressed by the Pentecostals that I met. I think we Catholics, again, this is a wicked expression of opinion, when we do contemporary stuff, we tend to do it very badly. We do traditional stuff beautifully. So if you go to a church and you hear Gregorian chant or polyphony or Veni Veni Emmanuel, it's sublime. It's the most magnificent musical tradition in the history of humanity. Our contemporary stuff tends to be these shocking, tuneless, banal, hideous folk ditties of the 1960s, which every other part of the culture has long since abandoned and burned. But our beloved church doesn't change for 500 years, and then when it changes, it doesn't change again for 500 years. And we had the terrible misfortune of changing in the 1960s when musical tastes were at their absolute worst. And whereas, the Pentecostals and Planet Shakers, they don't do polyphony, and so it's a lesser form of music, but they do contemporary music in the service of the gospel absolutely magnificently. There's a lot to learn from them. Their use of the social media, their sort of brilliant outreach to young people. It's very clever, and I hope the denominations learn things from each other. I was inspired by all the good denominations, evangelical, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Orthodox. I interviewed the Coptic Pope and also a Coptic politician. I asked the Coptic Pope if he'd ever been tempted by atheism, had no idea what I meant, and we had to go through the question about 12 times. He finally got it translated. Then he thought, I could see him then looking at me for the first time, and in his eyes was the expression, they're very weird people, these Australians, aren't they? That was great fun. And then Campion College, I'm very devoted to Campion College, the Catholic Liberal Arts College in Sydney. It's absolutely magnificent. I was saying to someone earlier, if I didn't have a family to leave my few shekels to, I'd certainly leave it to Campion College. Out of nothing, with no resources, it's created this magnificent environment with a whole Catholic tradition and the great tradition of Western civilization, Plato and Aristotle and Dante and everything else, is studied coherently. It's a higher education institution devoted to the proposition that the truth is true. What a revolutionary proposition. It's the most radical institution in Australia. And I came to the conclusion after my travels that the mark of success of a religious movement today are typically three things. Very strong, bold, self-confident leadership, very, very clear, uncompromising beliefs, and thirdly, a form of worship whose beauty reflects the moral beauty of the message which they're trying to say. Very clear and uncompromising beliefs. I don't think you ever win anybody by saying Christianity is really just the secular world, but a little more kinder. Because in the end, that's appealing to people who've had to live through a rigorous Christianity for a little while. But then the ultimate human reaction is to say, well, if it's just the secular world but a bit kinder, I don't really need it. I can just do the secular world. If it's just about poverty alleviation, don't get me wrong, that's very, very important, central part of Christian social mission. But if Christianity is just about poverty alleviation and not about God and Jesus and redemption, then people say, well, actually, I don't need Christianity to do poverty alleviation. In fact, I'd rather go to the races. Why would I bother with all this stuff? So I think you've got to have uncompromising beliefs. And I think you're better off to conceive of ourselves, we're better off to conceive of ourselves as a self-conscious minority, to demand minority rights. Of course, we're not demanding minority rights for ourselves, we're demanding minority rights for the truth. Obviously, this is a very challenging time to be a Christian and to be a Catholic right now, for reasons that you all know. But nonetheless, the command to continue boldly to proclaim the truth is as strong on us in the difficult times as it is in the easy times. I mean, far be it from me to routinely quote scripture, I'm the foreign editor after all, but it doesn't say somewhere in the New Testament, the culture will be moderately unsympathetic to you. It says, the world will despise you for my name. Well, final thought, I'm an Irishman after all. Situation desperate, advance on all fronts. Thank you.